Brooke, thank you so much for joining us on the You're Not Alone podcast today. I'm super excited to have you on. We were kind of chatting about this for a second before I hit record, but my wife heard you on the Skinny Confidential, him and her podcast. She listens to that podcast religiously. She sent it to me. I listened to your episode flying over the Pacific from Hawaii to San Francisco. And I think that the title of your book may cause side effects. It is such an important body of work right now. As an advocate who's been in the space advocating for the last 5 years, I do feel that talking about medication now that's almost become taboo. It's like a topic that we sort of tiptoe around, and I feel like you sort of go head on right into the conversation. I feel that antidepressants aren't a one-stop shop. That is my perspective. I live with a chronic brain disorder diagnosis. From your perspective, what caused you to question taking medication?
Well, I mean, the first thing, just to go back a little bit, is it's interesting to me that you think that talking about medication is taboo, because in my experience, it's almost become a badge of honor for people. And I see it being so talked about.
That's amazing.
In a way that I find to be pretty astounding and maybe a little problematic. So I'm sorry, ask the question again. I was just thinking about that. What was the first question you said again?
So you know what? That's actually interesting in your circles, because you're a magnet for these topics. Then are you seeing psychologists and psychiatrists more open to having the conversation, or is it friends and family and people that reach out to you on social that have heard your story and they're like, hell yeah, like I've been on SSRIs for X amount of time and like I had all these side effects and it didn't do what was marketed to me. So I guess I am glad that you actually brought that up. I'm curious, do you see it coming from both the clinical side and with people, or is it siloed in one group or the other?
Well, if we're talking about de-prescription and the idea that, people maybe shouldn't be on these drugs long term, especially when there's not a single study for the long-term effects of antidepressants. I would say that the conversation shifted a little bit over the past couple of years. There's a few major articles that came out in the New York Times. New Yorker did a big piece, and that was all between 2018 and 2020, sort of pre-pandemic types of reporting that told me that the conversation was shifting. Then the pandemic hit, and suddenly seems to be the only tool anyone has is to throw antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs at people and children and just, hope for the best and send them on their merry way. And so I see both. I see that, yes, there has been some shift in the idea that, okay, maybe we need to figure out how to take people off of these drugs safely, especially people who know they don't want to be on these drugs anymore. And at the same time, I also continue to see an astounding amount of overmedication and of a sheer nonchalance with that. From all sorts of everyone. I mean, whether or not it's an OBGYN prescribing, or I had someone who recently came up to me and told me she was just diagnosed with breast cancer, and that quite literally with the diagnosis, they gave her a script for Effexor, because the theory is, well, if you have breast cancer, you must be depressed too here, right? But none of these conversations is anyone saying, wait a second, is this something I need to be on? Is it safe? What will happen if I come off of it? What are any of the consequences, as opposed to, because it's not an innocuous sugar pill.
No, it's not. And my jaw is just dropping to the floor hearing you share that example with the breast cancer, because it was interesting when at the very start, the onset of my brain disorder, I went to a general practitioner and I told him sort of the classic signs of depression. And I mean, he basically cut me off in the middle of me talking. It was just like, took out his pen and his pad and just started scribbling a prescription. Now, granted, this was back in 2016, But still, I feel that just how quickly we just shortcut right into the medication, it does make me wonder who's pushing that agenda, who is driving that agenda, so that we're getting away from other treatment modalities. Not saying that medication can't be a part of it. I guess, do you have any thoughts on that? Because I know big pharma that's a buzzword that's being thrown around a lot since the pandemic, but it doesn't seem like we've put a spotlight on big pharma and said, hey, y'all need to be held accountable. It feels like we're almost trusting them more than ever before. So what are your thoughts?
I mean, that's an extremely huge question, and a very complicated answer that, I probably am only privy to a small section of even what's going on. But I think we can look to something like the opioid crisis as a little bit of an example of how something that started off, as this drug we would give to people having panic attacks and became something totally different. And then the consequences that have come from that, even though there are identified people who were part of that problem. And we can kind of watch what's happened with that and say, well, at best, we're getting a slap on the wrist and maybe a small amount of money that would be life-changing for most people, but for these people is nothing, right? So I don't really think that there's a world in which anyone's going to be held accountable, at least on the level of corporations. It just doesn't seem likely to me in our lifetime, which is a bummer, because it would be a lot easier if we could, top down this problem. But I think instead we got to go from the bottom up. And by that, I mean that individuals and parents specifically who are considering medicating their children really need to understand that there are much larger consequences here than they're being told. And it's not necessarily because their doctor is a bad person and trying to screw them over. It's because the nature of medicine has changed. The insurance system is really screwed with the way people get treatment. Doctors are overworked. They spend more time billing than they do actually caring for patients. In some cases, they're incentivized to use certain drugs over other modalities, for either because they're getting paid on the side or because that's how their hospital's getting funded, right? I mean, It's really complex issue. And so the point is just that you cannot pinpoint it on any one particular outlet. It can feel really validating to do that, but it's kind of a useless argument at the end of the day. But what does need to happen is that the individual needs to look at themselves, or the parent needs to look at themselves and say, what role do I have in this situation? What information is coming at me? What am I going to take and apply? What am I going to reject? How do I basically learn what my inner compass is telling me to do? Because whether or not that's for, what medication should I or should I not take, or even how you relate to your own, let's say diagnosis, right? I mean, people are champions at creating an identity around having a mental illness, especially kids, like in teens. I mean, I did it for 15, 20 years. So I'm well versed in how validating it can feel to say to yourself, I am depressed and I have no control over that. And it's just my brain. So that's why my life is shitty, right? That's a really easy thing to do. But what all of this is going to ask you to do is, when you're ready, there's going to come a day where you realize that that story you're telling yourself isn't panning out anymore. And I hope to God that when that day comes, people have a good support system around them, because that's what you then need to start making really hard choices to change your life and start coming out of it. And if you can do that, wonderful things are waiting on the other side. But that's a really hard thing for people to do when it just seems like we're so, bound up by the constraints of society or financial issues or whatever that is.
Yeah, the things that stand out to me, kind of themes: trusting your intuition, and finding agency in the process. And I want to ask you about getting there, but what I will tell you is it's so interesting what you just touched on around identity, around a brain health challenge. And as an advocate in the space too, because I can tell that you're a magnet for certain conversations. I feel the same way in my line of work. And one of my very best friends opened up to me a few years ago about his depression. What was interesting, though, the last time that I saw him is that exactly what you said was a big part of his identity and belief system that he was carrying around, which was, this is how my brain is wired. I'm a depressed person. I'm always going to be depressed. And so because that was his belief system, every action and everything that he thought was in alignment with that belief system. And it, up until recently, it's ruled his life. And what was so exciting for me is that this last conversation, he said that the belief system that his brain was just wired that way, and that's just who he was, is actually what was keeping him stuck. And that every single day moving forward, he was going to wake up and just prove to himself that he was somebody else. Even if he didn't feel it, even if he still felt depressed, he was going to take actions that he believed somebody who wasn't depressed would do. And the cool result with that is that his depression has started to go down. Now, that's an anecdote. That's not like, hey, this is what you do and this cures your depression, but it's just, you touched on something so important, which is agency. And then you touched on intuition. And that's what I'm curious about, because you said that for 15 years of your life, this defined you. Can you take us back to like the catalyst? When did you, I just shared the catalyst for my friend, when, like, where he woke up one day and he was like, enough of this shit. I have to make a change. When did this happen for you?
Well, just on that note, I was just looking up, there's this quote by Kurt Vonnegut, who's one of my favorite authors, and I might be getting a little wrong, but it's effectively, we are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful about what we pretend to be, or something like that, right? I mean,
right.
And a lot of, habit forming science will tell us that if you start doing the thing that you perceive people who you want to be like do, you will eventually come to see yourself as that kind of person. So if you want to see yourself as an athlete, and then every day you put on your sneakers and go for a run, you do that enough times, you're going to start to see yourself as a runner, right?
That's
so
right.
There is a level of diluting ourselves into action, which I think is, an important part of this. And then beyond that, I think we really need to kind of address this obsession with identity that we have right now in Western culture. I mean, everybody's just got to put some sort of flag on themselves saying, this is who I am, right? But what that does is, by saying, okay, my identity is this, and then you pick your category, or you pick your few categories, right? It puts you in a box that really gives no room for nuance. It immediately creates a sense of otherness between you and people who are not in your category.
Yes.
And it's gonna eventually come back to bite you in the ass if you go too far down, right? Because what we really are is, we are stardust combined from, the Big Bang back when, and then we have souls that are looking to express and be in the world and change over time. And if we are so clinging to that identity of whatever it is, right, that doesn't give us really the opportunity to change and grow that we need. So
I'm getting chills over here, by the way. That was so well said and so important. And the last few I don't know what it is with this podcast right now, but I'm not even kidding you. The last few conversations I've had, I think people are, maybe at some point in time, people were starving for identities to create that otherness, that separation, that, like, maybe it felt like, oh, if I create this identity, I belong somewhere. Like, maybe it was a sense of belonging, but now it seems maybe the pendulum swung too far in the other direction. And there are so many identities now that we can go out into the world and pick and adopt to then create that otherness that you said, that I do think is starting to become a little bit harmful in society. I think we're starting to lose the stardust. I freaking subscribe to that. I love that so much. And our souls looking to be fulfilled. I'm a sucker for that as well. And we're missing the humanity. Because the last few people I've had on is like, we talked a lot about cancel culture, and that cancel culture is a lot surrounded around identity as well, and being a part of an in-group and an out-group. And if you're a part of the out-group, we don't want to talk to you about your belief systems. We just want you gone, done.
Right.
And it's just, that's a really interesting point that you bring up. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, I think there's a confusion between identity and community, and what people are really searching for is connection and community. And they think that's found through common identities.
That's right.
When it's not, right? Because really what you're trying to do is recognize yourself in another, no matter who they are. And that's connection. And that community can come from that. And we used to have a lot more community, whether or not that was through, gathering around a fire hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago, or even, when church was a much more common thing for everyone in town would go to church on Sunday, and that's where you would have your community, right? We've lost a lot of those, traditions and whatnot in institutions, and I think it's leaving people really lonely, and so they're searching for something, and that's when the search for identity comes into play, and finding people who will validate effectively your sense of insecurity about who you feel like you are.
Absolutely. So did your depression then define a part of your identity for a good portion of your life?
Oh, yeah. It's very convenient, and there are lots of perks to having these stories about yourselves, right? I mean, you don't really have to be all that responsible for your future. If things go wrong, then you can blame it on the fact that you're depressed. If you're nervous about something, you can blame it on anxiety. I mean, it's a real way to talk yourself into not pushing the envelope and to doing hard things, whether or not that's having hard conversations or experiencing new things. And it keeps you stuck for a long time too, right? It inhibits action. It inhibits change. So in my case, I mean, I was diagnosed with an anxiety and depressive disorder when I was about 15, after my father had passed away. And then I was put on all these antidepressants, and the message I got through that action was that if a doctor, and my parents were signing, my mom was signing off on it, but if the adults in my life are saying that I need this, and I'm only 15, and up until now, my relationship with doctors has been that I get sick and they give me cold medicine and then I get better, right? There's this feeling that they know what is best for me.
Right.
So if I then take that information in and I, metabolize it as a 15-year-old, the narrative that started to form in my head was there's something fundamentally wrong with you in a way that needs outside help and outside support to manage, and that you will never quite, you will never quite be healthy. You will never quite be good. You're just going to have to accept that whatever was happening on the day someone gave you that first script is the best is what you're at. That's your baseline, right? Anything else is just, maybe is a perk. So it wasn't something I realized at the time, but it was just reinforced through actions over time. And so then as I went to college, and again, I go see a psychiatrist in college, and she doesn't really question anything. And then I graduate and I moved to New York City, and then the next one doesn't say anything, and then the next thing you know, I have some general practitioner telling me, you've been on it for 6 years now, I'm sure it's fine, here's more. Wow. It never forces you to actually look at the issues or the reasons, or to even consider, especially for me, when I went through puberty on these drugs and I was effectively a child, and then by the time I was 18, I was in charge of my own medical choices. So I was medicated as a child and then spit out as an adult under the assumption that my brain and body was not working as it should. I had no reason to question this and no frame of reference for what I was like as someone who was whole and healthy. So that narrative got so entrenched in me that I couldn't have separated it from myself at all until I realized when I was 30. So at that point, it had been 15 years that I had been on all these drugs, and I was having suicidal thoughts, and it was pretty bad. And I was objectively miserable in my day-to-day life. I mean, I just hated it. And I just had a light bulb moment that said, wait a second, I shouldn't be this depressed if I'm on this antidepressants. Like it was just, you know, it's like in the name, antidepressants. I'm depressed. Something's not right here. So
Right.
that's when I was like, huh. And then I started to kind of go down the process of, okay, what would it be like to get off these drugs? I didn't start that process with the intention of not being on any drugs. I started that process with the intention of figuring I needed something else, but that what I was on wasn't working. So we were going to need to find a baseline and then pick something new. It
Mm,
wasn't until I got totally off and started living in an unmedicated world for the first time where I realized, oh shit, I've been missing a lot and there's a much more to this story and I need to
mm.
start exploring it.
Very powerful. The one question that comes to mind based on what you just shared is, I mean, I know your frame of reference is skewed. Can you reflect back being younger, being first on them? Did it ever actually help with the depression, or did you feel happier on them? Because the catalyst, I'm assuming, I don't want to make assumptions, so correct me if I'm wrong, is your father passing away.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have depression prior to that? I guess it's kind of hard to be a kid and know what your frame of reference is, but
Yeah.
I mean, so I'm right in the sense that the catalyst was your dad's passing,
Yes.
and then did they ever work? Did they ever help? Because to then be 30, and you said it so beautifully. It says it in the name. It's an antidepressant, and I'm depressed. So if this is really working, I shouldn't be feeling this way right now. Did they ever work? I mean, did you just habituate to them? What happened?
Well, the first thing is that I'm an intense person and I was an intense kid.
Mm,
And intense people who feel deeply and are very sensitive, I could be very angry or very sad or very happy. I mean,
mm-hmm.
I feel a lot and I was an intense kid. So
Yeah.
when my dad died, there was shock value, and I think I was put into a state of shock. It was a very traumatic experience, the whole thing, not just because he died, but in the way it all happened in the series of events.
Right.
So my default when things are really emotionally intense is I start to actually shut down and get really stoic. And so that was what was going on. Is there was a period of about a few months where I was like, I hadn't cried. I was going about my day to day and I was concerning the adults around me because I wasn't showing any real
Emotion.
signs of emotion. And so I got taken to a child psychiatrist or psychologist. And that's when she said, you need a psychiatrist, not a psychologist, and sent me off. So the emotion was it's all internal. And I think I was processing it. And so by the time the antidepressants came around, I mean, I was a compliant kid. I was a good kid. I wanted to get good grades and please my mom. So if she said, maybe we should try this, or do you want to try this? I mean, for me, I didn't know. I was just kind of like, okay, whatever. And
Right.
I also liked the attention. I mean, I'm fully able to admit that at this point, is that as a kid, like as a 15-year-old, there was something almost, kind of delicious in the sense that so many people were paying attention to me and I didn't really want that to stop. And,
Mm,
I think, again, a lot of kids, a lot of teenagers are looking for that. They're looking to find a way. And if this is like, oh, people are not only going to give me attention, but they're also going to validate that I feel bad or that
mm,
I feel intense, then great, let's just do what they say and, keep feeling special.
yeah.
So I don't remember ever being like, oh God, I'm depressed and not being able to get out of bed. That wasn't the situation. I was still going to school. My grades
Okay.
slipped a little bit, but we went from A's to a B plus. I think maybe I got one C on a history test. I mean, it was a little alarming given that I was so bookish, but in retrospect, it was really not some crisis. Um, and then we also have to keep in mind too that, my mom was grieving as well. And it
Yep.
was just me. I'm an only child. So she went from having a family unit of 3 to one of 2. And the one person she had to bounce all the stuff off of was gone. So she was also in her own place of just trying to do the best she can. So I don't hold any grudges against her. And she's my best friend, and we talk all the time and have had so many conversations about this. But I think that's important to note too, is that she was just doing what the doctor said because she wanted to believe that this was best for me as well.
Absolutely.
So once I actually got on the antidepressants, we had to try a few because the first couple I tried gave me very obvious physical side effects right away. I remember one made me extremely nauseous.
Okay.
And another like put me to sleep, like head on the desk, snoring in the middle of calculus kind of thing. So
calculus will do that to some people too.
That's true. Maybe it was just the calculus, but we ended up on a combination of Effexor and Wellbutrin that didn't create immediate obvious side effects. I do think they created a lot of physical side effects pretty soon after, but at that point we thought it was a different issue. So but then, yeah, I don't know. I was kind of dull around the edges. I was numbed. I mean, I guess, as opposed to feeling grief, that felt pleasant. That felt like, I guess, a little bit of an improvement.
Yeah.
But what was actually happening, right? We were inhibiting a very natural process.
Right.
That I needed to go through and I needed to experience. And we were not in a big C crisis. So instead, I just got numbed out real young.
Yeah.
And then stayed numb until if you're numb long enough, might feel good for a while, but then you start to feel flat and then you start to lose all reason to live because all the reasons to live are also numb.
Yes. Yeah. So that feeling, the way that you just broke that down, I think was so beautiful, because that's what I was going to ask. Like, if it numbed you out and you weren't able to go through the proper grieving process, what I was going to ask was essentially, did the depression just linger from that event, and it sort of lingered because there wasn't that opportunity to process it fully, or was it the medication numbing out all of the emotions, the highs and the lows, and because it was also numbing out the things that you once enjoyed, there wasn't as much excitement, and because there wasn't as much excitement, your brain responded to that, which then led to you being 30 years old, waking up like, I'm on antidepressants and I'm depressed. This isn't working. What are your perspectives on that?
I think there were two things happening at once. The first, that is kind of a more, I would say, psychospiritual, would be that by not being allowed to grieve because that connection to myself was cut off, and also being a really intense person. So I carried a lot of anger around this, around my dad dying. And I didn't quite know it, but when you kind of just bottle that anger up and you put it inside you, it starts to fester.
Yes.
And it's something that doesn't feel like it's a big deal in the beginning, but as time goes by, that festering gets more and more infected, and you get to a point where it is driving you.
Yes.
So what's interesting is I had that anger that was inside me driving me. And I was also on these drugs that were blunting the intensity of it. So all that was happening is I was just getting more and more and more kind of internally discontent and depressed. I mean, and I just kept saying, well, it's because I am depressed. Like that was the excuse I was able to just say. It's because I'm depressed.
Yep.
And at the same time, I think we can't ignore the actual biological components that were happening by the long-term use of this drug that screws with your brain, right? So these drugs are known to get less effective over time. They're known for people to get more depressed long-term. They can actually change the chemistry of the brain. They can change how the neurons, or excuse me, they can change how the receptors react. They can create brain shrinkage. They can actually change the way your body is processing things. And so I don't know, because I wasn't, going under an fMRI machine every day, and no one is. So we don't really know how this affects individuals. We just know that these things can happen. So I don't know. I really can't say like how much of this was the biological changes that were happening in my brain because of the long-term use of these drugs versus just the sheer lack of ability to process all my emotions and the years that had built up and the avoidance from all those years that kind of led to a moment where, something had to change. Otherwise, I was going to do something drastic, right? I don't know. I think both things are relevant to consider.
I appreciate you saying that, because I immediately go to my own life, where I was a chronic pot smoker for like 7 years of my life, and get into corporate America, start to experience anxiety and depression due to intrusive thoughts that I was struggling with. And the intrusive thoughts, turns out, is what was driving that physiological response, that psychological response, the emotional response. But I think that it was happening well before I got into corporate America, and I wasn't consuming cannabis as much. And I feel that I numbed myself out, and there was just this slow buildup of all of these different emotions that, had I felt them coming on early on and then been able to take some healthy, appropriate action, it wouldn't have come in like a swell. Because basically, once I stopped smoking pot, it was like, holy shit, what is this brain that I'm with? I don't even recognize this brain. And I think that you talking about the medication is very similar to that, where it's almost that pushing down of emotions. If you can numb it out, you don't have to think about it, and you don't have to address it, but it doesn't mean that it's not there. And that is such an important point that I think you're bringing up. And that's oftentimes what's missed in the recovery journey and in these conversations.
Yeah. Sometimes when I talk about the science of all this, I tend to stumble over my own words, and it's because I'm not fully sure of the science, because nobody's fully sure of the science, right?
Nobody is.
I don't want to say something that's going to like be wrong. On the other hand, we really don't know. Like, no doctor or psychiatrist in the world knows exactly how antidepressants work. There are a bunch of hypotheses. The chemical imbalance theory was one of them. That's been,
Debunked.
Thrown out the window
for
pretty significantly in the past, what's been 6 months, but that was a prevailing, theory for a while. So I think it can be really difficult we want an easy answer. We want to say, okay, this drug's going to act on this part of the brain, and it's going to create, it's going to put an excess of serotonin here or dopamine there or whatever. And then blah, you're going to feel better. Or you take it away and you feel worse. We want it to be really, really clear, but it's not. And the reason is because this is a psychospiritual crisis, not necessarily a biological one. There can be biological factors, but to assume that everyone's walking around with a chemical imbalance in their brain or a mental illness is just, I think, the straight up wrong approach.
Yeah.
And what we're doing when we approach things from that perspective is ignoring everything you just said, which is the reasons why people aren't doing well, and other treatments that are more effective. I mean, just because maybe this works for some people some of the time, are we really going to throw the other 85% out who aren't part of the 15% who seem to do well just because we have that? And the answer is, well, that's what we're doing right now. But the reason why is because we don't have a clear, more cost-effective answer. So in absence of all of that, it really just, again, it forces us to turn inwards and to say, like, what are we ignoring? And people have to be really honest with themselves, which is a hard thing to do. But it's all just being covered up. It's not being cured, just like you said.
I appreciate you saying that. That was actually one of my questions, which was, do you believe that the medication can cure you, or is it just being covered up? And I wanted to hear your thoughts on that. You've also touched on psychospiritual, I think is the term that you use, and I want to unpack
it's the term
that.
I use.
I like it. I like it a lot. So I have that written down, and I want to touch on that. I do want to know. So are you on any sort of antidepressants today, or you're completely off?
No, I'm not on any prescription drugs and have not been on any since 2016. I had a very short course of antibiotics for an infected finger.
There you go.
In 2021, but that's
there
it.
You go. So, I mean, and obviously, I guess this is going to show my bias a little bit. That makes me happy to hear. I'm not anti-medication by any means, but it makes me happy that you can live your life off antidepressants and feel fulfilled. And I saw your Instagram story, you on the beach and talking about all the different things that you do to take care of your brain. I loved it so much because I talk about a lot of those components in my book. So I resonated. What was it like transitioning off of the antidepressants at 30 years of age? That's question number one. And question number two is, what did you learn through that process that you think is important for other people to know about during this conversation?
Okay, I'm going to answer the first part first, but then don't let me forget about that second part.
Okay. I'll write it down.
If we get sidetracked, because it's really important. So what you're asking about is antidepressant withdrawal, which is effectively what my book is about, and what that process was like and how it manifested for me. And the reason why I wrote my book is because at the time, so I went through withdrawal in 2016, 2017. The first, scientific paper to come back that even mentioned antidepressant withdrawal came out in 2015. So it was a really, really baby of a topic at the time that I was going through it, to the point where I couldn't really find any research or any indication that what I was going through was real, other than, there was a couple of message boards with other people saying they were experiencing this. But I thought that I was, kind of a rarity. I thought I was, just having a very extreme reaction, and that most people were fine. And I just kind of got the real short end of the stick. But the more I learned about it, the more I realized that this is a far more common thing than we thought. The research we have now says that approximately 50% of people who try and get off antidepressants experience withdrawal, and 25% of those 50, so a quarter of the people total, experience severe withdrawal. So given the tens of millions of people on these drugs, it's not a small percentage. So I wrote this book in order to help patients understand that if they're going through something similar, like, it's quote unquote normal for withdrawal. I mean, it's not a normal thing, but like, it happens to me too. And also so doctors could help better recognize signs of withdrawal in their patients, because with antidepressant withdrawal can look a lot like a relapse of the original ailment, so of depression or anxiety, or it can look like a reemergence or an emergence of a new psychiatric disorder, such as schizophrenia or bipolar. And people all the time get diagnosed with bipolar when what they're really experiencing is withdrawal.
Well, that's huge. I don't want to cut you off. If you're going to continue to talk about more signs and symptoms of withdrawal, I'm just going to let you go. But I want to make sure that those get touched on, because that is massive. Because otherwise, I could see somebody else then getting put on a different medication.
That's exactly what happens, and that's exactly what would have happened to me if I had not had a very important conversation. So, there's acute withdrawal and something called protracted withdrawal, which is long-term withdrawal that can last for months to years for some people, whereas acute withdrawal is very early stages and can be really intense. And so I had both, but the acute withdrawal for me, specifically, this was coming off of Effexor, is I had really intense, intrusive thoughts that were like almost intense to the point of hallucination. Like, it wasn't that like I was looking at a lamp and I saw it, morph into a demon. It wasn't that, but it was like there was a film kind of over what I was doing, where I could see how something could change in the world. And it was always really negative, violent, intrusive thoughts about hurting myself or other people.
Yes.
So that started happening to me within about a week of stopping my Effexor. Wow. And I got so scared, because what I thought was that, oh my God, I'm actually a crazy person and I'm going to go out and like physically hurt someone else in a very violent way.
Yes.
And I was too scared to tell my psychiatrist, because I knew that if I told her, she would consider me a danger to myself or others and put me on an involuntary psychiatric hold. I would end up in a psych hospital in New York City, which is not a place you want to be. Probably would have been pumped with a whole bunch of other medications, been told that I'm now bipolar or schizophrenic because I'm having these, visions.
Yeah.
And then your agency's gone, your rights are gone. You're now stuck in a system until hopefully someone can get you out. So I was lucky that I was able to have a conversation with a psychologist friend of mine who was across the country, so I knew she couldn't commit me.
You were like, I got some distance.
Yeah.
You can't get to me.
And yeah. And so I told her what was happening, and she said, very important word. She said, crazy people don't know they're crazy. And I think this is just withdrawal. And that was enough for me to say, okay, I'm going to believe that this is withdrawal. Like, I made a choice in that moment to believe that that was not me and that this was the lack of having the drugs in my system.
Yes. Can I ask one
And
quick
that
question?
lasted for a while. Yeah.
Because I am so fascinated right now. And I'm writing down acute because I know that we're in that phase right now. And then you're going to talk more about the longer term. This came up on the Skinny Confidential where you talked about those intrusive thoughts. Do you still have those intrusive thoughts to this day? Do you feel comfortable sharing that, I should say?
Sure. So when I was in withdrawal, it was pretty relentless and constant. Like, I lived in New York City at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I would go to the grocery store and be surrounded by people, and it was just constant everywhere I looked. And it was incredibly, incredibly
anxiety
disturbing.
inducing. Yeah.
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 So now that started to go away when I started to do a lot of really deep emotional work, a lot of therapy and counseling. And when I started talking about it openly is when that really started to go away.
Yeah.
So I would say that I probably had like a full reprieve from having none of those intrusive thoughts for maybe about 3 or 4 years. And then I think in the middle of COVID, something started to come back. And it came back for a month or two. And it was interesting because I was like, well, this is new because the last time this happened was when I was in withdrawal, and I looked at what was going on and I said, okay, I was under a huge amount of cognitive and physical stress.
Yeah.
Hey, COVID.
Right. Totally.
Both of those things were happening again. And I was in, a relationship that was also stressful. But what I had learned was that because I had been through this before, I knew that it wasn't like some sudden onset of some, disease.
Yeah.
I knew that this was a signal fire.
Yeah.
This was something in me that was saying, like, you need to address what's going on in your life.
Yes.
And I called up my therapist and we started working and we did some real hard work together. And then it started to alleviate. And so now if it does happen, one, it's not nearly as gruesome or violent. It's more just like, I think almost everyone has had this where you're driving down the side of the road and you're like, what if I just turned my car off into the median?
100%.
I talk to people, everyone says they have that, right? It kind of feels like that. And so they're a little bit more like that. And if I just notice that it's happening a lot, I say to myself, okay, something's off here. We need to recalibrate the world a little bit. One second, I'm going to make myself not be blinded.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine. The reason why, I saw that light creeping in. I was like, she's doing a great job holding it together with the light like right here. So the reason why I asked that question is because, and I'm not diagnosing or doing any of that. I'm just sharing my understanding of. So I was diagnosed with OCD in 2016. I'm pretty plugged in with that community. And one of the subgenres is what they call harm thoughts. I'm sure you're familiar. I'm sure that, and you probably don't subscribe to that. And it sounds, I don't know, your experience sounds slightly different. But for some people, like for me, I've had all sorts of intrusive thought. I've struggled with harm, intrusive thoughts. I've struggled with what they call sexual orientation, intrusive thoughts. I've struggled with contamination, intrusive thoughts. Like I've contracted HIV. I need to go to the doctor, and after I go, they're like, no, you're fine. You don't have it. I feel temporary relief. And then those intrusive thoughts start to come in again. So when I heard that on the Skinny Confidential, I was like, I wonder what her perspective is on that. 100% though, you talking about them as a signaler really, really resonates with me, because in times of stress, like heightened periods of stress, my intrusive thoughts tend to get worse. And then in low periods, I don't really use the term remission. I do have intrusive thoughts more or less basically every day, but they don't control or define my life. It's almost like the example you use with like the turning the car into the median or like into oncoming traffic. I went through a talk therapy called exposure and response prevention. I'm not sure if
Mm-hmm.
you're familiar,
Mm-hmm.
but
I am.
that,
I'm not. Well, I've done something similar.
okay. Because for me, I've changed the relationship with the thoughts where I'm like, thoughts are just thoughts. They can come and go as they please, like clouds in the sky. They don't define who I
Mm-hmm.
am. Whereas at the start, like if I had a thought about picking up a knife and stabbing my now wife, that would
Mm-hmm.
send
Yep.
me into heart pounding, like severely depressed because it's ego dystonic, meaning
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel like I'm that type of person. And so, yeah, I was just curious about whether you still had some of those thoughts or not. And if you had been diagnosed with OCD, because I know that is, when you said having those harm thoughts, I was like, oh, I always associate that with OCD, but I could totally see that happening in withdrawal
Mm-hmm.
and in heightened periods of stress and distress, because your brain is like trying to get your attention any way it
Mm-hmm.
knows how. So I
Yeah.
thought that was interesting.
I'm sure I could have been diagnosed with OCD because of that. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm well aware when it was happening. I started Googling. It's what you do, right?
Yeah.
And then I saw that it was considered a form of OCD, and again, I think for a little while I thought, oh, good, there's a name for it. This is what it is. But then the
Yeah.
longer I sat with that, the longer I said, like, no, this is. Well, I kind of had caught myself, and I said, I'm not going to get wrapped up in this
An identity.
acceptance of this identity.
Yes.
For one, and for two, it came on so suddenly in withdrawal. I mean, it was there 1 minute and there the not, and or it was not there 1 minute and then there the next. And then it was relentless, that I knew that there was some sort of physiological thing that had kind of prompted it.
Mm.
What I'm not sure of, though, is, the brain is so plastic, and I mean, this is a silly way to put it, but so much smarter than we think it is, right?
Yeah.
I feel like when we experience something, it never really goes away. It's imprinted, right? So I think the fact that I've experienced that once,
Yeah.
I mean, it was multiple times over a really intense long period,
Yeah.
makes me more aware of it. It's like when you buy the white Subaru and then you start seeing white Subarus all over town. The same amount of white
Yes.
Subarus were always there, but you
I
see
love
them
this
now. And
analogy.
so that's how I feel about it. Like, because it's also it's a flywheel. If I have one thought, then that'll lead to, oh shit, then I have the next one. And then it could be like many minutes of having these intrusive thoughts just because I'm aware that I had one. Right. And so, I still very much, for me, this is purely, like I said, a psychospiritual issue, in the sense that it tells me that something in my world, and when I use the word spirit, people people either go woo woo or they go religious. It's not really either one. It's more of like the essence of consciousness, right? The essence of what my kind of inner compass, my subconscious, is trying to tell me that I'm not paying attention to. That's when I talk about spirit, what I mean. And so for me, it without fail means that there's something I need to recalibrate. And very often for me, I find it's super simple at this point. It's usually that if the intrusive thoughts start coming up for me, it's purely that I'm not spending enough time in meditation. And I don't necessarily mean just sitting for 20 minutes, although that can, very often when this happens, I will then just say, all right, I'm going to go sit for 20 minutes every morning, and eventually it goes away. But I mean more just in whether or not it's being in flow, or it's being in nature, or it's being with people who really nourish me. It really, for me, it always tends to be I'm doing things that are bad for me. I'm getting distracted by, crap, whether or not just crap. I mean, like too much time on Twitter or whatever, right? It's just,
Right.
It's like if you eat chips all the time, your body's going to start to tell you to stop eating chips. If you eat intellectual chips all the time, if you consume intellectual chips, your brain's going to start telling you to stop. So that's what it is for me.
Totally. Yeah, completely. I've used the analogy that we're consuming a lot of junk food for our brains.
Yeah.
And so we're experiencing a lot of junk thoughts and reactions to that.
Right. It's very, if you expose yourself to really negative things all the time, eventually you're going to start seeing that in your day-to-day world and feeling it in your body. So
absolutely. And that's looking at the brain and body as one and looking at health holistically. And I don't know if everyone's there yet. What's interesting about your relationship with your intrusive thoughts is that when I experienced mine at the start, I couldn't get away from them. So I was trying to like suppress them and not have them. And like, oh, I just had a thought about picking up a knife and harming someone. Oh, shake my head. Like, I get that out. Don't think that. I don't want that. And the harder I tried to push them away, the worse that they got, to the point where I was just in a loop of I just was so stuck. I couldn't get out. So, and the way I understand it is they call that being sticky, that the thoughts were sticky. It was like, no matter how hard I tried to push them away or think about something else, I just couldn't get rid of them. And the way that I was able to get rid of them was through ERP and meditation. So I can tell that you're a meditator as well. And then after I would address one genre of thoughts, it would switch to something else. So I'm curious for you, do your intrusive thoughts get sticky, or are you able to like sort of gently brush them away? Do you just sit with them and eventually over time they dissipate? Has the genre of thoughts changed? Has it gone from harm to something else? I'm just curious, because that imprint on the brain is something that like I resonate with.
Yeah, it's really annoying. You can't unknow. You can't
No,
unsee
you can't.
Sometimes.
You can't. It's true.
When I was in withdrawal, it was relentless and sticky, and I didn't know what was happening, so it was really scary.
Yeah.
Then when it kind of started to come back in a non-withdrawal state, I had the confidence to know that this was not permanent, because I had at one point, I'd been through it in withdrawal and I'd gotten through it, and I had a long period of, none of it.
Yeah.
So I said to myself, okay, well, if I did that once, I can do it again. So I got curious, and it was a matter of digging. It was still highly unpleasant, but again, at the same time, at that point, I was in a new situation. So I was living with my boyfriend at the time, and I had to tell him what was going on, and that sucked.
Definitely.
And that really sucked. But once I told him that, and he I think had read my book and a draft at that point, so we kind of got it, and he gave me the space to do the work I needed, so that was helpful. And then since then, now I don't find now if they're sticky, it's really short term, like sticky in the sense that, oh, it pops into my head, and then maybe like for the next 30 to 40 seconds, I'm kind of aware of it. But I find that for me personally, it's mostly exacerbated by people. So if I can find time to be alone,
yes,
then it really shuts down and quiets down. And if I make sure I get enough alone time and enough, again, creativity and flow is key for me.
Yeah.
Then that to me really seems to be like the antidote. It doesn't really change topics for me too much, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't move, I don't go to a contamination space.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. That's really helpful too, because they categorize OCD as intrusive thoughts that take up more than an hour of your time a day. That's kind of like the benchmark for like, okay,
cumulatively or like an hour-long blocks, because to me that's two very different things.
Now you're gonna have to fact check me. Like hour-long blocks.
They're probably not that specific.
Over the course of your lifetime. So like an hour each day, an hour or more each day is, I think, how they define that, is where you're completely wrapped up in intrusive thoughts and compulsing. So doing something.
Okay. Like for an hour-long chunk period, like you lose an hour.
Yeah. You quite literally
washing your
lose
hands or whatever you're doing.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And anything below that, they don't really categorize as OCD. So that was interesting. I wanted to understand that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to derail us. I was just, because I think, and this is what is so fascinating about the brain, because you also have such a valid point in saying that these intrusive thoughts for you are a signaler that something psycho-spiritually is out of balance.
So I want to interrupt you for a second, just because this just came to me and I think it's really important. At least for me, I think that, well, when also when I've heard a lot of other people talk about this, I think that these intrusive thoughts are very much a threat to the ego. Like when the ego is put in a place where it's being threatened, the sense of self and identity, and again, not social media hashtag identity, but like your awareness of your existence in the world as a human on this planet is threatened. I think that's where a lot of this stuff can come up. And the reason why I think that this may be the case, and this is pure hypothesis, and I'm open to discussion and learning on this, but people talk about the type of intrusive thoughts that I experienced in withdrawal are very similar to what I hear some mothers experience in postpartum depression.
Yes. Yep.
And that to me is not a sudden onset of OCD. That is a huge, huge threat to the self and the ego. And when suddenly your agency is completely about somebody else, and like your safety is basically out the window, right? If you are an exhausted mother and you cannot get what you need on, again, the psychospiritual level, because you have to care for this infant, otherwise you get thrown in jail. To me, what seems to come up then are these really serious, severe, scary thoughts. Because there's some sort of again, threat to consciousness almost. And that's what withdrawal felt like to me. In the sense that everything I knew about myself was out the window to a point where it felt dangerous to be me in my body. And so, at least for what I experienced and for what when I've had discussions with, women about this in postpartum, that to me feels what it is like, is a threat to an ego. I don't know if that's what it feels like in your case on more of an OCD spectrum, if that's where we're going to put it. But I think if mothers, maybe had more of an open ability to be able to talk about their intrusive thoughts and more of that spiritual support in that huge time of transition, we wouldn't need to put them on antidepressants.
I agree with that entirely.
So easily.
Yeah. There is definitely an ego component, and I agree with you on that. I'm going to write that word down. Because so basically in the OCD community, what they think is that, and again, we haven't identified the genes. It's like everything that you and I have talked about. Like
no gene has been identified for any psychiatric illness.
I know. So it's just so fascinating. But what they think is that there's a traumatic event that sort of the genes are lying dormant. You either have them or you don't. But again, getting back to agency, I want to be very careful. Even if you have OCD, you're not defined by the disorder. And that is something that mentality that you brought up earlier is how I define my life, is that this does not define who I am. It's a part of me, but it's not all of me. But getting back to what I was saying and to what you were talking about with ego, they basically think that it's epigenetic, it lies dormant, and then when something traumatic happens, it activates the genes responsible for those intrusive thoughts. That's the discussion right now in the space. Trauma is an attack on the ego, because you talk about becoming aware of, you become conscious of yourself, your being in the world. For me, I started to experience intrusive thoughts. Keep in mind, I was getting high all the time. I was in college and I was smoking a lot of weed back then. I was partying a decent amount, but I experienced my first heartbreak. And roughly 3 to 4 months after sort of like I can't eat, I can't sleep feelings went away, which I feel that depression and anxiety was very much so the feeling of deep rejection, which I think is an attack on the ego, to your point.
Mm-hmm.
I started to experience intrusive thoughts. And
Mm-hmm.
I was basically self-medicating and kind of able to get away with them, get away from them without really addressing them or doing any work. And then again, like I told you, it wasn't until corporate where I was really just trying to carve a path for myself that I became aware of what was going on inside of my brain. But there are so many people that I have interviewed that have OCD where a traumatic event, birth can be
Mm-hmm.
traumatic. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
birth is traumatic. A friend of mine just told me about his wife's whole birth process, and it freaked me out. I was like, I'm scared for my
Yeah.
wife and I. Like, it's
Yeah.
women have your warriors, because it's just what you have to go through to give birth is just, but that's traumatic. Breakups are traumatic. Death is traumatic. And I do think that it is an attack on the ego. So I think that that is a really interesting point that you bring up. I mean, for me, when I unpack the ego side of things, that rejection made me realize and feel very vulnerable and
Mm-hmm.
very um
Like nothing is safe, and that at any moment something
can
unexpected could happen that
can be
may or may
taken
not
away
be your
from you.
fault.
Yeah.
Like I can grab this knife and put it into this person I love. I can
Yeah.
do that. The possibility is there,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
It's like all the timelines all at once that just come into your brain.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. So that's an interesting point that you bring up. One of my good friends, she's a therapist that treats OCD. She specializes with postpartum. So it would be interesting to get her perspective on this.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that you bring up some valid points. Do you, I guess, from your perspective, do you feel like in your journey that the medication and going through withdrawal was that attack on the ego then? And that this is that the chemical leaving your system was that traumatic event in a sense, and it was your brain then responding?
Um, I mean, when we're talking about pure ego in the most classical sense, like not like you're an egotistical person, not
Yeah.
it's all about you, not that. When we're talking about in consciousness, I guess is more of a way that can be described. I know that there was something that when these drugs were suddenly out of my system, there was a there was chemical chaos because my
Mm,
brain and my body for so long had been operating under the assumption that these things were going to be constant, and then when it wasn't, there was chaos.
mm,
I know that. I think that my interpretation of it is very much when the kind of the ego feels like it becomes assaulted is in the interpretation, because it's scary. I mean, when you have that much fear, all sorts of things happen,
right.
and there's all sorts of meaning that you glean from an experience like that it fills you with so much primal fear. So I don't really know how anyone can come out of something like that and not be fundamentally changed. I think
Right.
the problem is that we don't really have a way of, or a lot of people don't have a way of processing that, and whether or not that's just through time or because there's not enough support from other people, or there's too much shame and they turn inward and stay there. I'm not sure, but
Yeah.
you don't go through the experience that I went through and come out the same.
Yeah.
That's for
So
sure.
so let's get back on track with that then. So there was the acute withdrawal, and then there was,
Yeah.
I can't remember the word, the more long term.
Protracted.
Protracted.
Yeah,
What was that
protracted
like?
withdrawal. Protracted withdrawal is a longer state of, withdrawal or disorientation that can happen for weeks to months to years. I've heard some horror stories of people in withdrawal for years. I was probably in withdrawal for about 2 years total. 1 year in particular was like all symptoms all the time. And then
Mm,
the second year was more, okay, we're starting to come out of it a little bit. I have moments of feeling good and like myself is supposed to be. And then I
mm,
would kind of go back into a wave where I would be, experiencing withdrawal symptoms. And so for me, we've talked about the intrusive thoughts. Other symptoms were incredible mood swings,
Mm.
just absolute 0 to 100 on the rage scale, like basically like a toddler not being able to control their emotions, or a teenager. I often describe it as like it was like being in second puberty, where I like
Yeah.
really my hormones and my whole body was going just completely bonkers. And so, you could be laughing and then sobbing and screaming from 1 minute to the next, and it
Mm.
really makes you feel pretty batty. um I also experienced for physical side effects, like I had a lot of sensory issues. So all five of my senses went pretty nuts. My
Mm.
eyesight actually got better. I
Oh,
remember
wow.
one day everything sharpened and I was kind of like, what? Oh, I can see better.
So interesting.
Yeah. My hearing really intensified and I became extremely sensitive to noise. That has
Mm.
been the longest, most lasting thing. I'm still far more sensitive to noise than the average person. I don't think it's withdrawal anymore. I think it's just being hyper sensitive, and also just kind of like we said earlier, like I can't undo what's been done. So it's just the threshold for me is lower. And so I've learned how to deal with that. My skin got extremely sensitive. I struggled to wear clothes that weren't really light and airy. It would feel very scratchy on my skin.
Mm.
I developed something called nodular vasculitis, which is an autoimmune response where the blood vessels swell. And so I looked like I had all of these kind of like BB gun type lumps and bumps in my arms and
Mm.
legs.
Mm.
That's a stress response. So basically my physical body was put into so much stress during withdrawal that an autoimmune issue popped up.
Yeah.
I had tons of gut issues that I'm still 6 years later trying to figure
Navigating.
out, which has
Yeah.
been a really big pain in my ass. Um,
Yes.
and then emotionally, there was just a huge, like, there's just these huge gaps and question marks. I mean, like when you've spent that long in one story and suddenly you're in a different one, it's a very disorienting place to be. So
Mm.
amongst all the emotional side effects with the mood swings, then the psychological side effects with the intrusive thoughts, and then the physical side effects, with my body feeling like it was falling apart or not being able to handle being in the world, then you have this kind of, you know, internal side effect where you're like, well, who the hell am I if it's not this? And you have to start building that up. And that's when you have
Mm.
to start really questioning your choices in your life and cutting people out or quitting jobs or leaving, all of which I had to do, and
Yeah.
literally starting over from scratch and learning what you like and what you don't like and who you are and what's good for you and what's not. I mean, I said all of my symptoms went a little nuts. So did my taste, right? I'm a professional chef for a living. I've been
Yeah.
doing that since 2008. Like, I hated ginger pretty much until, I don't know, a few months into withdrawal. And then one day I had ginger and I was like, holy shit, this is delicious. It was the strangest thing.
Yeah.
And my entire sense of what I like to eat and what tasted good to me changed. The kind of music I like to listen to changed. What I watched on TV changed. I suddenly couldn't relate to any of this person I had built. So
Mm.
that's also why withdrawal can be so difficult, is because you're busy having to learn who you actually are while you're also managing this cascade of symptoms. And honestly, like I feel like I was lucky compared to some people. I didn't have what's called akathisia, which is this internal restlessness and sometimes physical restlessness where
Okay.
people literally can't stop moving
Oh,
because their nervous system is so dysregulated. People get brain zaps too, which is like an electric shock that goes through the brain.
yeah.
I didn't have that either, and that's a really common one. So I hear those two, unfortunately, quite frequently, and I feel so grateful to not have had that, even though it was still awful.
Yeah, it still sounds like you had a long journey ahead of you when you started to cycle
Mhm,
off. What did like and this is getting back to the question you asked me to write
mhm.
down.
Okay.
What did you learn through that journey? What do you want people to
Yeah.
know? Can people get through that journey a little more smooth, if that's
Yeah.
even possible?
So there's the practical, which is kind of, here's the list of things you need to take to your practitioner and talk to your doctor about. Um, what because I was doing this at a time when we really didn't know anything. My psychiatrist didn't know anything either. So everything that I did is completely against what should be a more common protocol at this point. But there's something called hyperbolic tapering, which is basically a dose reduction method of approximately 10% each time. So if you do the math, let's say you're on 100 milligrams of whatever drug, you make your first cut is 10% of that. So then you stay on 90 milligrams for a while. And if you're feeling good, you make another 10% cut. So that's 9 milligrams that go away, right? So now we're on 81 milligrams. Then the next time we cut 8.1, and then we start getting into math that I can't do in my head. But the point of this is that the curve starts really steep and then it rounds out and it gets flatter over time. So you're actually cutting down by smaller and smaller dosages. And in order to do this properly, the easiest way you can do it is, one, you really need to have a practitioner who understands this concept, who can prescribe appropriately for you. It's really helpful to have what's called a compound pharmacy in your town. That's a pharmacy that can say, we're going to make exactly 73.4 milligrams of this drug, whether or not it's in a capsule or in a powder, or maybe it's suspended in a solution that you can titrate out when you get down there. Some people are literally taking their drugs with eyedroppers because they're that sensitive and they need 0.5 milligrams of something and they can't just stop. Some people need that. Some people can come off a little easier, but a compound pharmacy can stop people from having to be their own drug lords. Because if you don't have a compound pharmacy in town, then literally people are sitting there with drug scales and razor blades and counting beads and capsules. But the tricky part about that, and the reason why you really want to have someone who is on your side and is willing to educate themselves from a prescriber standpoint, is you can't cut some drugs in half. Like I did that at one point. I thought, I want to get off one of my drugs, I'll just cut it in half. Well, what I didn't know at the time is that when you cut that particular drug in half, you break the chemical chain and it screws with the time release. So we think we're being smart about these things, and as it turns out, there's so much we don't know. So that's why it's so important to have a doctor or prescriber who's willing to learn and with you and create a good plan. And if you don't have that person, find one. It's really okay to fire your doctor if you need to. I know it can be difficult to find prescribers, but it's better than the alternative, I think. And then the second thing to note, like that's just a practical thing, as far as the logistics of this, that's the best information that is out there right now. It's not perfect. Some people still really struggle tapering down that way. Some people can just step off no problem. Some people struggle so much that seems like they need to get off the drugs quickly so it doesn't stay in their system. So it's all a very individual thing. But the second part of this answer is that what this process will teach you to do, and if you let it will teach you to do it really fast, is to learn how to listen to your own intuition and your own inner compass. And I think intuition is something that a lot of people really don't know how to listen to. They confuse it with their, monkey brain. But this process of withdrawal, especially if you're having side effects, is really going to force you to look at your life and see what makes you react in a positive way, what makes you react in a negative way, what's too much for today, where can you push, right? If you learn to let it teach you what your body needs and what you need to be doing, then you can take that lesson through your whole life and it becomes really, really, really valuable. So for me, despite the fact that withdrawal was awful and I feel like I felt like I had to completely start my whole life over because I had left my home and my business and I had no money and I had to start a new career in a new place and it just sucked. And then there was all the side effects too. And over the past few years, I have not made any of the same mistakes I made when I was, depressed in my 20s because I really care about what happens now. I really want a future and I really want the one that's right for me. So I'm incentivized to make choices that will support that. And because I so learned how to listen to my intuition and my body throughout withdrawal, I can apply that when choices or situations or people come my way now. And eventually, I mean, you just get good enough at it that it starts to feel natural. It's like second nature. You know what's good, you know what's bad. You know when to say yes, when to say no, when to back away. But you have to learn it.
Can you tell me, how did you learn to tap into your intuition and start listening to that?
So there's a few strategies that I learned, but probably the most important one is to take a step back, like try not to react. That's the first one. Whether or not it's in anger or in happiness or whatever, or excitement, to just take a step back. And then what I like to do is I would just kind of find a quiet place and close my eyes. And let's say we have two options, make it simple. Option A and option B. I would close my eyes and I would think to myself, what does it feel like? How can I imagine what things would be like if I went with option A? And I would just pay attention to how things felt in my body. Like, would I feel kind of tingly and like I just had a sip of champagne and kind of excited and open? Or would I feel kind of nervous and closed, or maybe like my throat was closing up, right? And typically, if I paid attention to either one of those things, am I feeling expanded or am I feeling constricted? That is the question. If A is expanded and B is constricted, even if my monkey brain is saying, oh, but with B, you could do XYZ, you know, you can have this opportunity or meet this person or try this thing.
Right.
But it still felt kind of constricted. That would be my symbol to say, nope, like we're trusting my body and we're going to go with A, even if at the time it doesn't feel quite like the right choice or the logical choice. And I found that if I listen, if I completely ignore what my body's saying and I go with the thing that's making me feel constricted because maybe it seems like a better opportunity, it usually turns out to be a mistake.
Yeah.
I still sometimes do that, but the thing that I've learned now is if like let's say, okay, I have an expanded and a constricted choice, but there's something about the constricted choice that like I'm not willing to immediately say no to, then I just try and gather more information. And I kind of just try and overdo the amount of information on that particular topic, and usually that will lead me to a place that tells me why this is not the right choice. So
that's
the
really
two
helpful.
lessons are: one, take a step back, put some space between you and the decision.
Yeah.
Because if there's a true emergency, you're going to operate on instinct. So, you know, it'll be fine. But if it's not an emergency, take a step back, ask yourself, does this thing make me feel constricted or expanded? And then just trust that if you go with the expanded choice, it's going to lead to where you need to go.
What does an expanded feeling feel like? I'm curious. And what does a constricted feeling feel like? Because I think that would be even helpful for me as I'm learning to tap into my intuition more.
Okay. So constricted to me is easier to define because it feels pretty clear. Like it literally will feel like a tightening in my throat. Or like I just kind of want to curl. Like sometimes if I don't know, but I can kind of pay attention to what my body's doing, like I'll actually kind of curl over in almost like a self-protective position. Whereas if I'm expanded, I might notice that I'm sitting really straight.
Yeah.
And kind of not have noticed that I'm sitting up straight. Constricted could also be just some sort of kind of undefined agitation or fear.
Yeah.
It could be even just, it could be verbal, just the word no.
Yeah.
Or I don't know even. Expansion for me feels like a chill down my spine. And like, or like the first sip of champagne, just something that's kind of like, yeah, you know, just kind of like, oh, like a little giddy, just up, you know, kind of stepping outside into the sun for the first time during the day. There's just kind of like this lightness to it that, and there might be some excitement, and you do have to learn to parse between excitement and anxiety because that feels pretty much the same. But
they're opposite sides of the same coin. So that's a good point.
If you can separate that out a little bit, it just feels, it can feel calm. It can feel like the word yes. Curiosity is a great sign too. I find that if you're struggling even with this expanded or constricted thing, and you're really trying to get to basics on intuition, follow your curiosity. Even if it seems really silly, like you're driving home and for some reason you want to go the other route. Like, that's curiosity. Go down that route. You know, when you go to a restaurant and you look at a menu, instead of trying to make the intellectual choice of like, oh, what's the best for my diet today? Or do I need to get some omega-3s from salmon? Like, think to yourself, no, like what is speaking to me on this menu? Is the salmon speaking to me more than the steak? Or but you know what? Sometimes you just want the steak and the French fries, and just get that because that's what's speaking to you. Like, what are you curious about?
Yeah.
That can be a feeling people are pretty easily familiar with, even if intuition seems pretty foreign.
Yeah, that was really helpful. I think even like the word no or the word yes, I feel like sometimes that even bubbles up in my life, and it's a sign that it's either something that I should pursue or shouldn't. I thought that was really helpful. I've had you on here for a while. I feel like every time you say something, I'm like, I have a new question. So let me get to like last two questions then. You said that there were some mistakes that you made in your 20s that you're very intentional about now. I think I'm a big proponent of learning from other people's mistakes so that I don't have to go through them. And I would love for my audience to hear what you went through, some of the mistakes you went through in your 20s so that they don't have to. If they can just skip past that and get the lesson from somebody else.
Yeah, I mean, I would love, I'll share an example, but I'm not sure it, you know, I find that with these things, you usually have to make the mistake, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But for example, like I had an opportunity, and I think I touch on this very lightly in my book. I owned a bakery in New York, and I had a business partner, and we were great friends. We were terrible business partners. And I had a moment before we really got into the nitty-gritty where she asked me, she actually said, I think I know you really want to do this, but I'm not sure you want to do this with me. And I didn't want to hurt her feelings in that moment, even though I knew that she was right. And so I said, no, sure, let's do it. And what followed was 6 years of difficulty for both of us.
Yeah.
That ruined our friendship. So that was my intuition being real loud and clear, but my ego not wanting to hurt, I didn't want to hurt her. And more importantly, I didn't just want to be uncomfortable in that moment.
Right. That actually happened to me too. So I really relate with that with that example. That's a really good tangible example. Yeah. And you can expand that out just in terms of all the relationships that you have in your life. And they all serve a different role and function. And just because somebody's a great friend, when you're running a business, for example, there's some roles that need to be run and different expertise that people need to show up with, I think, to make a business work. So while it might work in friendship, it might not work in business. Same with like more romantic type relationships. So I think that's really, really important and valid. Anything else from a mistake standpoint that you want to share? Or
I would say that kind of expanding off of that one is just that there's this idea that once we make a choice, we kind of have to see it out. There's a big narrative that you don't want to be a quitter. And I think that that's a really that can be very destructive in the right context. I mean, there's also, you know, we're putting aside the people who, you know, have one bad day at their job and quit after 2 weeks and do that over and over again, right? But like in the situation like me with the bakery, it started bad and it got worse. But I really did not know how to extricate myself from the situation. And there was so much fear over what was I going to do and what would this look like to other people and how painful was it going to be that I stayed in it for way too long. And I turned around and did it in a relationship right after. So like, look, it's not like it's not a one and done lesson, right?
For sure.
But I mean, I would hope now that maybe I finally got the message. But I think the point is just that, at least for me, when I was depressed and when I was on all these drugs, I didn't believe that any situation would be better. I thought it was just all irrelevant. Like, I was going to be depressed no matter what. So you may as well just keep doing the thing you're doing. And that was such a self-defeating prophecy, because I was like, I mourned that time in my life when I was living a life that was meant for somebody else. It wasn't the life I wanted. I didn't even know what I wanted, but I knew it wasn't that. And I didn't have the strength, and I was too scared of what might happen if I backed out. And that really ran my life for a very, very, very long time, until I hit a crisis point where I had to go through all that stuff anyway.
Yeah.
So I think if you know that something's not good, I mean, there's just a lot of trust in your own abilities, and that the universe will support you enough to kind of get back on track to where you want to be. And I didn't have that trust then. I do now.
So I love that so much, and I believe that the belief that like the universe has your back type mentality is so critical. So let me ask you this last question to give people some of that trust. What are some of the things outside of medication that you've implemented into your life that have brought you that fulfillment, that happiness, that joy, and have helped reduce symptoms of depression, so that people can, if they're on the fence about medication, they have some tools that they can take with them now, and put faith in the universe that everything's going to work out.
Yeah. So for me, I call these my non-negotiables, and I have learned over the years that if I identify my non-negotiables, then they're a non-negotiable. So I don't have to worry that they're gonna get screwed with, and I just have hard boundaries around them. And for me, they might be a lot more practical than people think. Like, one of the most important things for me, I've realized, is having light on two sides of my house. So if I'm in an apartment or if I'm in a home, I need to have like windows coming from two sides, because if I'm in a dark place, I go to a dark place. So in this way, I have sun that comes around from all angles, usually during the day. I mean, I live in a very modest place, but I just made sure, okay, like when I choose somewhere, I'm looking for light on two sides.
Yep.
In a similar vein, I've realized it's really important for me to be able to see the sky out my windows. So if you're in a big, dense city, that can be hard. I realize some of these things that I'm talking about are just like dripping with privilege. But if you have the opportunity to pick your light, pick some good light.
Yes.
So I like to be able to see the sky, even better if I can see nature. So I live in like a little community where I can see other townhomes, but there's also little there's desert right outside my window where I can see coyotes wandering around, and that's awesome. Just important for me.
Yeah.
The other things that are really important to me are to have a long-term project or a long-term goal. I've realized that, and I'm talking like multi-year long things that can kind of be my anchor.
Yes.
When other things are very fluid, especially I'm a freelancer most of the time. So, sometimes you don't know if you're going to have a contract next month. So it's important for me to have a long-term project. Usually that thing is not necessarily something that I tied to myself to financially. For example, like the book, for a long time, I wrote it before I had an agent or anything. So I didn't know if it would ever sell, but it was important. Now I'm learning how to oil paint, and, so just like these long-term things really ground me. Getting sunlight, going outside, moving, exercise, really, really important to me personally. I think everyone benefits from it, but for me especially, like, I need to be able to challenge my body and move my body in new ways. So it's also long-term goals that get tied into that. And then, I mean, honestly, those are probably my non-negotiables, really, and almost nothing else is. I'd say everything else I can kind of make work depending on the situation. But, and those may not be the same thing for other people, but I think it's important to know what those things are. Like, and if you do, then it's a lot easier to always have a baseline that's supportive.
For me, I resonate with that long-term goal, and I don't think I could have articulated that until you just said that. There's something, talking about intuition, very calming and peaceful to me about something with a multi-year timeline, And while a lot of my it's interesting too that you brought up the fact that you don't tie anything financially to it, because there is something. Most of my long-term projects right now revolve around the business, but I do find that when I completely separate the project from like, how can this make money? And I'm just doing it because I'm like, this could help people. It feels so peaceful and enjoyable, and I feel calm, which are emotions that you touched on earlier when you were talking about intuition. So that really resonates with me, almost to the point where while you were saying it, I was like, I don't ever want to like hit some destination with this business. I hope that it just becomes this like 40-year project that I just slowly like enjoy. Like that feels so good to me when I think about that. So I'm really,
so that feeling, that's expansion, whatever you're feeling talking about this. So remember what that feels like. So that's expansion.
It feels really good. And I enjoy it. It's very peaceful. Yeah. It doesn't feel so like, just like aggressive or I need this to happen. It's just more like I'm having fun with the process. So I appreciate you articulating that. I just took something out of that. So to my audience, I just hogged that advice. I apologize. But that was solid. I agree with that. I think that's big for my wife too. Getting outside, experiencing, getting light, getting sun on her face. I'm the same way too, but she gets like, I need to get outside right now. So I definitely think there's something to be said about that. And then I use meditation and exercise too as a helpful coping strategy.
Yeah. I don't put, for me, meditation is not a non-negotiable. Too many, oh God, a lot of negatives there. Double negatives.
I know, that trips me up too.
Yeah. But what is a non-negotiable, another one is no phone in the bedroom. And I have it set like, so it's on downtime until significantly later than when I get up in the morning, because my morning routine, I always want to do something, usually throughout the first hour in the morning, that is unrelated to work and is again, just for me. So whether or not, it could be a number of things. I could give myself a yoga class. I could meditate. Sometimes I just read. Sometimes I go for a walk in the little valley behind me. Nice. But the point is that the noise and the chaos doesn't start until I'm ready for it to start.
Yeah.
And then the phone can turn on and I can get all the messages and emails and stuff. But again, just putting that space in between me and the rest of the world is when my brain calms down the most. And when my brain calms down, that's when there's the fewest intrusive thoughts. That's when there's the most calm, the most peace, the least amount of anxiety, depression, whatever you want to call it. Like, is when we're calm.
Yes, totally. I completely agree with that. I think that is a beautiful place to, that was a great sentiment, and I completely agree with that. The only thing I'll say is, do you have any other advice that you would give somebody who's right at the start of their journey with their mental health? Anything that you would advise?
Yeah, two things are coming to mind. One is there's this lovely meme, it's a cartoon, and on the top it's this little cartoon guy in blue, and he looks really sad, and he's very sad, and he says to himself, nobody gives a shit. And then below, he's all like in yellow and his arms are up and he's all happy and he goes, nobody gives a shit. And I think the important part to realize is that, like, it's really the latter, right? Nobody cares, like, in the best possible way. I mean, like, yes, I mean, we, I'm not saying we don't need, people to love and support us throughout our life. Like, I really hope everyone can find that. And if you don't have it, then cut those people out. But it's all about experimentation. It's all about baby steps. If something doesn't work, it's fine. Just like toss it away and try something new, right? Because at the end of the day, everyone is so consumed with what they're doing. If they're gossiping about you, it's going to be for 2 seconds and then they're going to go back to their own stuff. So it's really like, the world is really a place to experiment and learn about what you like and who you want. So try things out. And if you're at the beginning, that is the optimal time to try. And then to just understand that if you've been depressed for a really long time, if you've been on these drugs for a really long time, and let's say you're getting off of them, I have people all the time who they're like, I was on 4 psychiatric drugs for 20 years and I've been off for 6 weeks and I feel terrible. And I'm just like, okay, let's look at the ratio here, right? I mean, it's been 6 weeks versus 20 years. Like,
Right.
you have got to give your body, mind, and the world around you time to catch up to you. So, let's practice some forgiveness and patience. Let's also find some radical acceptance for wherever you are in this moment. But know that as long as you're putting the effort in every day, whether or not that's a little tiny effort, like maybe all you do is make your bed and that's as far as you get, like little teeny tiny steps will eventually start to add up and they will get easier. And then just surround yourself with success stories. It's very easy to go onto the internet and fall down a rabbit hole of doom and awfulness, and that's not going to help. So go for a walk instead.
I love that. You've been an excellent guest, Brooke. I appreciate you coming on. Where can people find you and access your resources, your book, everything like that?
You can find me all over the internet at Brooke Siem. That's BROOKESIEM. My book is May Cause Side Effects. It's available wherever books are sold, anywhere in the world. You can also get it on on Audible, or wherever you listen to your audiobooks. And yeah, that's where I exist. I also have a newsletter. It's called Happiness is a Skill. And I explore a lot of these topics as well as the latest antidepressant withdrawal research and just the idea that happiness is a skill we actually have to practice.
That's really cool, Brooke. That sounds like a really valuable resource. Obviously, y'all go check out the book. That book is wherever you like to digest your reading. May Cause Side Effects. Brooke, you were an awesome guest. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me, Zach.
Totally.